Welcome to this deep dive. We've got some real interesting F1 stuff to unpack today. You sent us those F1 blogs reports on the sprint qualifying and the main qualifying session at the Chinese Grand Prix, and, well, you really wanted to break down exactly what went down, so that's what we're going to do today. We'll try and hit those key moments and hopefully offer a few insights that might surprise you, really get you up to speed without drowning you in a sea of details. Sound good?
Sounds like a plan. We'll be zeroing in on those big names, of course, Hamilton, LeClerc, Norris, Piastri, Verstappen, and how Mercedes is shaping up as a team. But we also want to keep an eye out for any results that raised eyebrows, try and figure out what those might tell us about the team dynamics, how those are playing out. Oh, and a big welcome to everyone joining us through the F1 Blogs channel.
Let's dive right in then. Lewis Hamilton snatching pole position in the sprint qualifying. That was huge, wasn't it? I mean, the way F1 blogs put it, they really went all out, calling it an authentic barbarity. They really highlighted how he progressed through each session, too. And he managed to keep LeClerc at bay, who apparently sounded a bit, desperate on the radio, at least according to the F1 blogs report. But what I found interesting is that even Hamilton himself seemed pretty surprised by his own performance.
It's worth remembering Hamilton's history at this circuit, the Shanghai International Circuit. He's got the most pole positions here, 6, which is quite a feat. Vettel's trailing behind him with 4. So, yeah, he clearly has a knack for this track. And to grab pole with such limited practice, I mean, that red flag in FP1, that really threw a wrench in the works. They only had 10 minutes for soft tire runs. So, yeah, to pull that off, it really speaks volumes about his adaptability, his skill.
It does. F1 blogs even mentioned that Hamilton's 2/10 advantage over Leclerc, that was actually pretty much the gap everyone was expecting, at least initially, thinking about Leclerc's greater familiarity with the Ferrari and all. But it's almost like Hamilton closed that gap, that expected gap, within a single race weekend, although they do make the point that, we shouldn't get ahead of ourselves, reading too much into the whole season or even the main Grand Prix race based on just this one sprint qualifying result.
Right. The sprint qualifying, it's a different beast, isn't it? Shorter, different tire strategies, throws up some curveballs sometimes. But that doesn't take away from Hamilton's accomplishment. F1 blogs are spot on, when they call it something historic. It's a testament to him, to his mastery.
Okay, so let's dig a little deeper. How did Ferrari and McLaren stack up? Hamilton getting pole, that was the big news, obviously. But F1 blogs suggested that the real story was that 2/10 gap to Leclerc under, pretty similar track conditions. And this kind of leads to that age-old question. Is Ferrari miles ahead of McLaren now?
Well, looking at the bigger picture, F1 blogs seem to think that McLaren, maybe they didn't quite live up to their potential in that sprint qualifying, maybe a bit of overconfidence creeping in. They suggest McLaren's strategy in SQ3 wasn't exactly the best. Going out for that initial run, then coming back on used soft tires, just when the track was probably at its fastest. That's not ideal, is it?
F1 blogs actually go as far as saying McLaren lost the pole more than Ferrari won it, although they're quick to say that Hamilton drove a brilliant race, so it's not taking anything away from him. But that decision to run more fuel than their rivals and then try for 2 flying laps on those soft tires in SQ3, that seems to have been a pretty crucial factor.
But here's the thing. Even with that apparent strategy hiccup, Oscar Piastri was still right up there, just 0.080 seconds off the pace on his second set of softs. That says something about the underlying pace of that McLaren, doesn't it? But the analysis also points out where McLaren was losing time. Sector 2, those high-speed corners where tire traction is absolutely key.
Which brings us to Lando Norris's qualifying. F1 blogs really went in on this, focused on those errors he made. Even though he set a really competitive time in SQ3 initially, he seemed to struggle on that second attempt. Went wide at turn 14 on his final lap, which meant the lap was deleted. So, not great.
That brings up a really important point about consistency, doesn't it? At the very top level. His fastest lap that actually counted put him in 6th, a good 0.544 seconds behind Hamilton. And the replays, they showed errors on both of his SQ3 runs. F1 blogs specifically mentioned a mistake at turn 13, the one leading onto the back straight. And that was pretty costly. Losing speed down that long straight, that really hurt.
Yeah, like a double whammy, right?
Yeah.
Lose time in the corner, then you're carrying less speed onto the straight.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because Norris's first sector in SQ3, that was actually faster than Hamilton, Verstappen, Piastri, and Leclerc.
Right.
So the potential was there, but then, like F1 blog said, he hemorrhaged time in that last sector, all because of those mistakes.
And this is where F1 blogs get a bit, critical. They say that those sorts of errors, they're not really what you expect from a driver who's, got serious championship aspirations. They even brought up the Australian Grand Prix, where he had that near miss running wide at turn 6 and losing time to Verstappen.
Yeah. So it's all about consistency, right?
Yeah.
That seems to be the message. If you want to mount a serious title challenge, you've got to be consistent.
No doubt about it. Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about the champ, Max Verstappen, and see how his teammate Liam Lawson is doing. F1 blogs really highlighted Verstappen's ability to squeeze every last drop of performance out of that Red Bull, race after race. It's pretty impressive.
And what's fascinating is even though the consensus is that Red Bull might not have the fastest car on this particular track, Verstappen still managed to put himself in a strong position. His lap was like textbook perfect across all 3 sectors. Even managed to gain a bit of an edge in that final sector. And that pole margin, just 0.018 seconds, that's talk about precision. To achieve that, it takes immense effort, focus.
It's those tiny margins that separate the best from the rest, right? Now, looking at the other side of the Red Bull garage, F1 blogs didn't hold back on Lawson. They called his gap to Verstappen embarrassing, even staggering. Ending up in last place, that really shows how much some drivers struggle to find the sweet spot in terms of setup, especially after that limited practice time.
Let's zoom out a bit. The gap between Verstappen in first and Lawson in last, that was pretty much the biggest spread you can have. So yeah, it highlights how well Verstappen performed, but also how much Lawson struggled. F1 blogs think that driving the Red Bull, it's a very particular skill set, and Lawson, even with his F1 experience, he might be having a tough time adjusting, getting the most out of that car.
It doesn't bode well for him going into the sprint race. F1 blogs seem to think he's got a mountain to climb to get that car where it needs to be for the main Grand Prix qualifying too. Let's move on to Mercedes now. What's the verdict on George Russell and Andrea Antonelli? There seemed to be a pretty big gap between them.
There was. Russell qualified 5th, which is, pretty decent. Just 0.112 seconds behind Leclerc. But Antonelli in 7th, he was way slower than his teammate. More than 0.6 of a second. F1 blogs didn't mince words. They said that gap was not acceptable.
And if you look at the sector times, F1 blogs pointed out that Russell was a tad quicker in those first 2 sectors. But what's interesting is the overall difference in their times. You can't explain that just by looking at their best sector times.
Yeah.
So maybe there was something up with Antonelli. Maybe he couldn't quite string together a clean lap.
It's a tricky one. 7th place for a rookie like Antonelli, that's not bad at all. But F1 blogs are clear. He's not on Russell's level yet. Russell's really squeezing everything he can out of that Mercedes. Even if Antonelli had managed to put his best sectors together, he still would have been about 0.3 slower than Russell's qualifying time.
That's a pretty big difference. F1 blogs even compared it to the Red Bull situation, saying that the gap between Verstappen and Lawson, that's even bigger than the gap we're seeing at Mercedes. So looking at the bigger picture now, what were some of the surprise results from that sprint qualifying?
Well, the usual suspects are still up there. Ferrari, McLaren, Red Bull, Mercedes, they're all in the mix. But there were a few surprises in SQ3. Stroll in the Aston Martin, he managed to qualify ahead of Alonso, his more experienced teammate. And Albon, in the Williams, he out-qualified Sainz, though F1 blogs did say that wasn't totally unexpected given Sainz's issues with car balance.
Alpine, though, that was a shocker. Both their cars knocked out in Q1. That was not what anyone was predicting. F1 blogs reckon it might be because of that new technical directive they brought in for China. Alpine had to tweak their rear wing, and maybe that's thrown them off a bit. Something to watch, definitely.
Absolutely. The midfield's looking pretty tight, too. The Racing Bulls with Tsunoda, Williams with Albon, and Stroll in the Aston Martin, they were all really close in SQ2. F1 blogs say that Sainz being more than a second slower than Albon in SQ2, that's more down to Sainz's car balance issues than it is to Williams suddenly finding some crazy pace.
So they're saying that Williams' performance is probably more realistic this time around compared to that surprisingly strong showing they had in Australia. Seems like we're in for a close midfield battle all season with probably few opportunities popping up whenever those top teams make mistakes. Even Haas had a bit of a tough time, Magnussen ahead of Hülkenberg. And Oliver Biermann actually beat Bortoleto, which is a turnaround from Australia when Biermann was a last-minute stand-in.
All right, let's move on to the main qualifying session now, which obviously happened after the sprint race. F1 blogs start by talking about Lando Norris, how he did so well in Australia, and then, well, they say his worst version came back to haunt him in China.
Quite a difference, yeah. They say he didn't have a great qualifying for the sprint, then got overtaken during the race itself, and then, to top it all off, made a driving error in the main qualifying, had to abort his last flying lap.
What's interesting is, even with all that going on, Norris still managed to qualify third, behind Piastri and Russell, though. So again, it raises questions about Norris. Can he perform at the highest level consistently? Can he avoid those mistakes when the pressure's on?
Yeah, Australia seems like a step forward, real progress. But F1 blogs seem to think that this weekend in China, it's made McLaren doubt him a bit again. They do say that Piastri's looking really good this weekend, maybe even making Norris look a bit worse by comparison. And driving that McLaren, it's not easy, apparently.
But F1 blogs say that with Norris's experience and, his status within the team, they'd expect more from him. More consistency.
Okay, let's talk about Ferrari. How are Hamilton and LeClerc getting along? How's Hamilton settling in? Well, in the main qualifying, Hamilton finished 5th, LeClerc just behind him in 6th. And after Hamilton taking pole in the sprint qualifying, that's a pretty good start for him going up against someone like LeClerc. F1 blogs made a big deal about this, especially since LeClerc's known for being such a strong qualifier, and Hamilton's still, the new guy on the block.
This all ties into that big question, doesn't it? What kind of Hamilton are we going to see in 2025? The one who dominated for years, or the one who's had a bit of a rougher time lately? Those close battles with LeClerc, they suggest both drivers are performing at a high level. But F1 blogs also mentioned that Ferrari's engineers might have their work cut out for them, managing 2 top drivers like that, keeping everyone happy.
That's going to be interesting to watch for sure. How about Verstappen? He qualified 4th, which is actually ahead of both Ferraris. Quite a turnaround from the sprint qualifying.
Yeah, it just goes to show Verstappen can get a good result out of that Red Bull, even when it's maybe not the fastest car out there. Lawson, on the other hand, well, F1 blogs think he's going to have a really tough time in the race.
Yeah.
Starting where he is, it's hard to make progress, especially in F1 where clean air is so important.
Tough break for him. It's a difficult track to overtake on, too. Lastly, let's talk about George Russell. F1 blogs are really impressed with his consistency. He qualified 2nd, and he's been performing well all weekend. The podium in Australia, good result in the sprint race.
What F1 blogs are saying is maybe we've been overlooking Russell a bit. All the focus has been on Hamilton, his move to Ferrari, but Russell's been quietly delivering, holding his own against a 7-time world champion. He's definitely proven himself.
So there you have it. That's our deep dive into the Chinese Grand Prix qualifying. We saw Hamilton grab that impressive pole position in the sprint qualifying, and he kept up the momentum in the main qualifying, which makes you wonder how he'll stack up against LeClerc in that Ferrari. McLaren showed they've got the pace, but those strategy calls, they need some work. And Norris, well, he's got to work on that consistency if he wants to be a serious contender. Verstappen, he's still the guy to beat, even when that Red Bull isn't at its best. Lawson, he's got a lot to learn and a tough race ahead of him. And Mercedes, they've got a real star in Russell, while Antonelli, he's got potential, but he's still got some growing to do. The midfield is going to be a battle all season, that's for sure, and we saw some surprises up and down the grid. Don't forget to subscribe to the F1 Blogs channel for more in-depth F1 analysis. They really know their stuff.
We hope this deep dive has given you a clear picture of what went down in those Chinese Grand Prix qualifying sessions. We try to go beyond just the surface, really get into the details, look at the bigger picture, give you something to think about.
So what really stood out for you? Was it the Hamilton-Leclerc dynamic, the whole Ferrari situation, or McLaren's strategic calls and Norris making those mistakes? Or maybe it was Verstappen just doing what he does best. We encourage you to, go back, rewatch, maybe even check out the F1 Blogs channel. They've got loads of great stuff.
Here's a final thought for you to chew on. Given how things went for those top teams, how do you think those team strategies and driver consistency, how are they going to play out in the actual race? It feels like there are still a lot of stories waiting to unfold.